welcome back. Today we'll be in our second lesson of our unit this month from the Smith and Helway's Formation series, dealing with Paul's letter to the Galatians and the idea of freedom through faith. This morning's lesson we'll be working from chapter 3, and in chapter 3, I think Paul gives us three ideas. First, he is trying to encourage the Galatian church to turn away from this idea of faith through works. Secondly, he wants to remind them that because of the freedom that comes with salvation through grace, they can truly experience joy. Without the idea of grace, their joy and their freedom will wither. And finally, I think he's encouraging us to consider our theology. I know we all have that Sunday school answer about salvation through grace. We all say, yes, we believe that. But do our actions, our thinking, the things that we say, do they really reflect our belief in this idea? Today we're going to take a look at what Paul has to say in the third chapter and see if we can come away with some takeaways from this. Judson Edwards writes a weekly commentary to go along with the Smith and Helway's Formation series. In Judson Edwards' commentary this week, he looks at chapter 3 as consisting of 5 questions Paul asked the church, 2 illustrations to back up his claims, and then finally, what are the result of accepting justification through faith as opposed to works. Let's take a look at verse 1. You irrational Galatians, who put a spell on you? Jesus Christ was put on display as crucified before your eyes. Here Paul's asking the first question, which is about the cross. The Galatians had been visited by missionaries after Paul had established the church, and these missionaries were attempting to discredit Paul's teaching, claiming that the Gentile Christians must be circumcised and must follow the law. Paul wanted to remind them that their salvation was based on Jesus and the cross. There was nothing else that was necessary. Verse 2, I just wanted to know this from you. Did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Here Paul asks the second question, which is about their personal experience. He's asking them, how did they come to accept salvation? Did they get smart enough, good enough, religious enough, or did they learn of Jesus on the cross and accept in faith through the Spirit? Verse 3, are you so irrational? After you started with the Spirit, are you now finishing up with your own human effort? The third question Paul asked has to do with consistency. Paul wanted to know why they would start with grace and try to finish with a system based on works. Verse 4, did you experience so much for nothing? I wonder if it really was for nothing. Here in his fourth question, Paul is asking about their personal history. Paul wanted to remind them of their experiences related to accepting the gospel based on faith alone. Recall how much gratitude they felt and how much joy they felt by accepting it based on grace. Verse 5, so does the one providing you with the Spirit and working miracles among you do this by you doing the works of the law or by you believing what you heard? His final question is about the nature of God. He talks about what they experienced and about working of miracles, and he wanted to know, did this come because they became moral or religious or because of their deeds? Or did they experience God's goodness because that's God's nature? Paul's first illustration comes in verses 6 through 9. Understand that in the same way that Abraham believed God, it was credited to him as righteousness. Those who believe are the children of Abraham. But when it saw ahead of time that God would make the Gentiles righteous on the basis of faith, Scripture preached the gospel in advance to Abraham. All the Gentiles will be blessed because of you. Therefore, those who believed are blessed together with Abraham who believed. So here Paul quotes a couple of verses from Genesis and a couple of ideas. The first idea is that Abraham received righteousness not based on what he did, but based on the covenant God made with him out of grace. God was always a God of grace. And secondly, he promised that all the families on earth would be blessed because of Abraham. You see, God's righteousness, goodness, and grace was for all people. Verses 15 through 18 contain the second illustration. Brothers and sisters, I'll use an example from human experience. No one ignores or makes addition to a validated will. The promises were made to Abraham and to his descendant. It doesn't say, and to the descendants, as if referring to many rather than just one. It says, and to your descendant, who is Christ. I'm saying this, the law which came 430 years later doesn't invalidate the agreement that was previously validated by God so that it cancels the promise. If the inheritance were based upon the law, it would no longer be from the promise. But God has given it graciously to Abraham through the promise. Here Paul's making a point that the law came 430 years after Abraham in the covenant with Abraham. He's making the point that the law didn't invalidate the covenant with Abraham. In fact, later in chapter 3, Paul goes on to point out what the real purpose of the law was. The law was just to be a placeholder until the coming of the Messiah. Paul understood what was at stake here with this question of grace versus works. He also understood that if the church would embrace grace alone, three results would occur. First, he understood that this would free them up to quit having to try to impress everybody with their goodness. They would be able to simply enjoy the freedom and the joy of life based on grace. Secondly, they could stop trying to force other people to be so good. You know, when we base everything on a scorekeeping system or a checklist, you know, for ourselves, we also tend to be critical of others and judgmental of others. Grace frees us up from that. And finally, he wanted the church to become a church of celebration, not obligation. When we celebrate the idea of grace simply from God's goodness versus from our works, it really frees us up to experience the joy and express the joy of the Christian life. I want to leave you with three questions today that you might want to ponder based on today's lesson. First of all, contrast the things that you do out of a sense of obligation and those you look forward to doing because they bring you joy. Secondly, list some of the ways that we can be guilty of rules, regulations, and scorekeeping in our observance of religion. Why do we do this? And finally, list some examples of how we exemplify in our words and deeds that we really believe that the cross is enough.